Mark, I want to spend some time talking about automatic thoughts. We've spoken a little bit about these in terms of, even from our first session, about how these thoughts kind of pop into our head. And sometimes not always kind of have this negative connotation to them. So we kind of label them a little bit, but I just want to spend a little bit more time going into detail, just highlighting some of the components, sort of the elements of automatic thoughts, because I think that'll be helpful for us when we start exploring and maybe identifying and challenging some of these thoughts. You kind of might understand where I'm coming from. Does that sound okay?
Yeah, makes sense.
Okay. So one thing that's important to know is that all of us experience thoughts, right? Yeah, sorry. And the other thing too is we all experience automatic thoughts. And I'll say a little more details what the automatic part means.
Yeah.
But part of the reason why we call it automatic is that we lack awareness of these thoughts. So a lot of times when we come in and we say what happened or what's going on, we talk about our emotions, but we neglect sometimes to mention our thoughts. And if you recall earlier when we talked about the cognitive model, we talked about how more times than not our thoughts precede our emotions. But a lot of times what we focus on are the emotions and behaviors. Those are still very important, but if we sometimes want to change certain emotions, feel a little bit less distressed, and improve some of our behaviors, we got to work on some of those thoughts. Okay, so these automatic thoughts generally tend to not be a concern for a lot of people until they start experiencing distress. So whether you're depressed or not, or anyone else, we all have automatic thoughts. We all have negative automatic thoughts. But what happens if we start having a lot of negative automatic thoughts, we're not recognizing it, it's impacting our daily life, and we've talked about plenty of examples on your end, that's probably a sign that maybe we need to work on them a little bit more. So a couple of the elements, there's actually 6 of them. One of the components is that they appear like mentally in our mind like what's called shorthand form. So what that means is it's usually a short phrase or image. It's usually not just one word. A lot of times if it's just one word, not always, but generally it's an emotion. When it's shorthand form, it's kind of like, I'm never going to get this done. George doesn't like me. Doesn't want.
I'm a failure.
Sometimes I'm a failure might come a little bit closer to a core belief, and that's a good point. We'll talk more about those later. The core beliefs are more of a generalized term. So we could, for example, say I'm a failure. That could apply to almost anything, right? Whereas if I say George doesn't want to be my friend or they don't want to hang out with me, you can see how that's tied into a specific event, right? But you seem to have a good understanding of that. The other thing, too, that we've talked about a few times is it's almost like a cognitive reflex. If you think of a reflex, it's just something someone throws a ball at me, I quickly catch it. It's really fast. It's spontaneous, in other words, but it's also brief, too. So it's not only really fast, but it doesn't stick around. It just kind of moves out of our mind, right? So again, we're left with the emotions that are hanging there. That's the other thing, too, is they really are experienced as emotions, but they're often very, very strong. And so because of that intensity of the emotions, again, when we were talking about maybe some arguments with Melissa, struggling at work, or even again, after maybe you perceive somebody slighting you or not wanting to be your friend, those emotions are really intense, right? They feel pretty deep, but we're not necessarily aware of the particular thoughts that we have. The other one that's kind of tricky that will take some time is that they're often believed to be valid. True, right? You're sitting there thinking, no, that's true. But you've done a little bit of work, even with the activity scheduling, to realize that maybe sometimes these thoughts have some validity, but a lot of them don't have too much at all. And so when I say to you that the emotions are real, it's true because we perceive that thought to be true. One of the things that we're going to work on soon, in fact later today, is to maybe look at that thought and say, is this really a valid thought? Is this really true or not? I know that may sound a little bit weird, but sometimes when we kind of pause and reflect and look at it, and we have some exercises to do, maybe we can kind of challenge some of those thoughts to see how really true they are. One thing I've noticed with you that's also common as well is that these are persistent and they don't go away, right? Especially when you're having a depressive mood. They're also self-perpetuating, meaning that I could have one automatic thought and it triggers another one. The thing that comes to mind for you is when you're at work and you start thinking that I'm never going to get this done. And then maybe some of that's true because then the behaviors happen where you're not as productive, and then you start feeling guilty or saying things like, well, I'm not a good worker, I can't do this really well. And so they kind of spiral down and work off of each other. Is that okay?
That sounds about right.
And the last thing I want to say, and we're going to explore a little bit this later on in therapy if it's necessary. Okay. And I already used the word core beliefs before a little bit, and even today with your example, is that a lot of times these automatic thoughts sometimes can come from past experiences in our lives. Okay. So sometimes we may talk about maybe events that have happened, maybe even growing up as a child or adolescent, or it could be relatively recent in your life that maybe has some type of impactful experience on you. It may or may not always be relevant, more so for some clients, but what's important here is we call those core beliefs. Okay. So if you can look at it as like, here's the core belief, and then the automatic thoughts will stem from it. Okay. So that we don't have to spend too much time talking about, but it's something that we may explore later if we think it's relevant to what we're working on with you. Any questions so far?
I mean, it seems like it kind of makes sense. I mean, I've gotten a little bit better at kind of identifying
You've already been doing a good job with
I don't quite know too much about changing them just yet.
Right,
and how long that'll take. But I mean, it seems like it shouldn't be that bad.
No, and you've done a good job already beginning to start to identify some of them, even with your behavior tracking. So we were going to obviously revisit some of these components, and one area of potential hope is that even though it may not seem like it now, these thoughts and sometimes these core beliefs can definitely be changed or modified. It's just going to take some time, practice with each other, and then practicing on your own and kind of go from there. It's kind of like a rhetorical question. You can just kind of think about it is just imagine how your emotions might change if your thinking were to change as well.
It makes sense.
And we already kind of did that a little bit. If you recall, we discussed a couple scenarios where you felt maybe your friends slighted you or something like that. And I said, well, what if maybe if we had more information, or if we thought about it differently, maybe our emotions might feel a little bit different. Okay? So what we're going to do next is talk a little bit more of some of the scenarios that have been consistently brought up lately and kind of go through those and see if we can kind of identify those automatic thoughts and see if they're worthy not of looking in deeper into, and if it's necessary, maybe changing some of those thoughts. Okay? So we'll do that now.